Stephen Newcomb. Presentation topic: Our original free and independent existence as nations and peoples.
Gishilamieng, Mil Ongundawakan, Mili Ongundawakan, Ulinipali, Ulinipalinan, Wanishi, Gishilamieng. I want to pay my respects to the ancestors of this land and to the Shuswap nation and to the council members of the Shuswap nation who may be here today, and also to pay my respects to the Thompson River University and to all the organizers of this event, and particularly want to reach out to Art Manuel for having initiated this event and talked to me about speaking here some time ago. I wanted to say that I was very glad to hear the previous speakers from today, and I hope that my talk will provide some of the information to fill in some of the gaps and provide a little bit different context for what we've been discussing here as the doctrine of discovery, or as I prefer to call it, the doctrine of Christian discovery. And what I'll be specifically speaking about today is what I call the idea system of domination and subordination. And as I go through my talk and I read from a few source materials and speak about a number of things, I think you'll understand why I refer to it in that manner. I wanted to do a little bit of a retrospective, however, and realized today that it's 20 years since I had a kind of epiphany, a moment of revelation where I understood. I thought in 1992, you know, next year will be the 500th anniversary of the Intercessoria Papal Bull of 1493. And why don't we go to Pope John Paul II and the Vatican and call upon them to formally revoke that document that called for the subjugation of so-called barbarous nations. And so I had the good fortune to meet my friend and colleague and mentor Virgil Killstraight from the Oglala Lakota Nation, who is a ceremonial man. And we decided to go on a tour in different parts of the world to begin that campaign, and we did. And under Virgil's wing and guidance and so forth, with his connections, we were able to begin that work. And we made many trips to Italy, and I was at the Vatican in 2000. We went to other parts of the world, such as Australia, New Zealand, and he went to France, I went to England, and many different countries, and began to publicize that information. And I know that some people had begun publicizing that even before us, but it's amazing to look now and see that since the issue was brought forward to the to the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and working with Tanya and Chief Warren Lyons, we were able to move it forward. And so it's really very prominent on the world stage, and it's wonderful to see this event organized with a specific focus on what's been called the doctrine of discovery. One of the things I'd like to mention is a quote from Francisco de Vitoria, and he made a statement. He said, "Sovereigns, if they had to trace their title to their rule back to its origin, they could not keep anything they discovered." And of course, discovered is always in quotation marks. But one of the key points in doing the research that I've done over such a long period of time is to look at the English language, this colonizer's language that we're operating within today, and to look deeper into that language and to understand some of the meanings that are not obvious immediately, but when we dig a little bit deeper, we begin to see those meanings and to awaken to a different dimension. And I'll just give you an example. The word mortgage. It's actually two words fused together. The first is mort, which is death, and gauge, which is grip. And so if we say, I have to pay my death grip this month, but I don't know where I'm going to get the money, it puts it into a whole different context. And there are a number of words like that. For example, the word America is actually ame and rika. Ame is a command, love, and rika is riches and wealth. So it's a command to love riches and wealth. And so the American dream is the dream of riches and wealth. And these are just a couple of examples of how, when you begin to break English words apart and you realize that some 60% of English is actually originating in the Latin language, which is the language of the Roman Empire, then you can see the ways in which it can be easily manipulated for purposes of domination and control. Today, Louise did such a marvelous job of taking you through a tremendous amount of the history over the last several decades and understanding what's been happening in what's often called the law, but I prefer to put 2 additional letters on the word the, which is the letters IR, making it their law, and making sure that we make that distinguishment, that it's their law, the colonizers' law that they brought from afar. And but she did a tremendous job, as you heard, going through a lot of the minutiae of the cases and the way in which legal decisions are manipulated. And of course, you heard Walter Echo Hawk and you heard Robert Miller speak earlier on some of the origins of Johnson versus McIntosh. I think Walter did a terrific job of explaining the fraud that was involved in that case. And of course, Bob Miller did a tremendous job on breaking the doctrine of discovery down into what he sees as 10 elements in there. What I would add to that in terms of what he calls the right of discovery, I would call it the right of Christian discovery, because that's really how it was formulated in its origin. And also that Jeanette Armstrong has done such a wonderful job of illustrating what the traditional law system or the code of traditional behavior is, beginning with the origin stories. And the theme of my talk today, as you may see in the program, is the original free and independent existence of our nations and peoples. And what I mean by that is the original free and independent existence of our nations and peoples, meaning free and independent of that domination or that claim of a right of domination that was brought here so many centuries ago to this region of the world. And for thousands of years, our nations and peoples lived completely free of any of those assertions of claimed authority. So then what is the basis of their assertion of claimed authority? Well, there's an amazing book published in 1938, and it's called Creation of Rights of Sovereignty Through Symbolic Acts. Creation of Rights of Sovereignty Through Symbolic Acts. So what they're claiming in that book, and they illustrate with the countries of Spain and Portugal, Holland, Sweden, the British, the United Kingdom, as it's called today, the English colonization, and also Russia, that there were these different acts of possession that Bob Miller illustrated earlier. And they claimed that on the basis of these different rituals, that they were creating sovereignty. So in a sense, they're doing a magical ritual in their minds, and by throwing some dirt around or sprinkling some water, tearing up some grass, breaking a branch, waving a sword in the air, by these various tricks, as one participant in those ceremonies called it, along with a notary public who would make sure that there was a document with an official seal on it that could be filed with a particular, with the crown, and the planting of the flags, or what's called the royal standards, and the cross and so forth, that they've actually, voila, created sovereignty. And so what I call that is superstitious nonsense, and because that's precisely what it is. And the idea of sovereignty is actually something coined by Jean Baudin in 1577, and the official definition of that goes with it, going back to French absolutism, is supreme power over citizens and subjects unrestrained by the law, meaning that the claim of supreme power is not restrained by any law, but all of the citizens and subjects are supposedly under the domination or the dominion of that sovereign supreme authority. When you break the word sovereign apart, it's S-O-V-E-R, which is sover, which means super or above, and reign, which means to rule. So it's to rule from above, which is the theme of domination. And so they're claiming that they have a right of supreme power over our nations and peoples, over our lands and territories, and they call that the assumption of sovereignty in the Canadian case law, at least to the extent that I've read that. And of course, they don't even call it sovereignty, they call it an assumption of sovereignty, which is exactly what it is. And it's simply presuming something into existence. So in a sense, it's a form of mind control. When we actually interpret ourselves into their framework, then we are willingly, or I should say not necessarily willingly, but we are allowing ourselves to be pulled into that interpretive framework to our detriment, and by ignoring our original free and independent existence and the illegitimacy of their claims of a supreme power over our traditional territories, which are still existing at this time and will forever exist. Because you cannot take thousands and thousands of years of cultural and spiritual interaction with our lands and territories, with all the relations and relatives, all forms of life within those ecological systems and the waterways there, and have that simply disappear because of these rituals, superstitious rituals that they engaged in. And it's my contention that we need to go to those places where they conducted those rituals, and we need to reaffirm our traditional and spiritual connection with all of our traditional territories. And the way in which we are able to conduct ourselves, despite all the efforts to destroy our languages, cultures, and traditions, is still in keeping with the original instructions given to us by the Creator. Virgil tells the creation story from the perspective of the Oglala Lakota people, and he always points out that we originate in spirit. And all the forms of creation, all the ways in which creation manifested itself on this beautiful planet, there are laws that go with that. And in their tradition, they speak of those as the 7 laws that lead to the Wo Lakota, which is the way of life of peace and friendship, of peace and of allies. And those 7 laws are something along the lines of to honor and respect, to have compassion and pity, sharing and caring, or to carry the welfare of the people in our hearts, bravery and courage, humbleness and humility, seeking wisdom and seeking understanding, and bravery and courage. And when all of these are in their totality lived as a way of life, with the rules that are built into the kinship rules that are built into the language, it leads to a life of peace and friendship, and also to the ecological abundance of life, as Jeanette mentioned. And that's really that underlying code that she's pointing out there, because our languages are extremely old, and our ways and our laws are extremely evolved over such a long period of time that they have those areas of knowledge and wisdom in them that provide a model for the world community at this time. And they form an alternative to the domination, subordination system that's killing the planet through the tar sands and through all the various things that we could illustrate in terms of the ways that peoples and forms of life are being destroyed through genetic modification, through all of the various toxins that have been flooded into the planet, and because it's a way of life built on insanity. And so the underlying code is something that has been well illustrated in a number of documents. For example, and by that underlying code, I'm talking about the code of domination and subordination. It gradually dawned on me as I read more and more of the literature and the history that everywhere I was looking, I was seeing the words submission or subjugation or subdue or conquer, conquest, conqueror, and so forth. And gradually it formed in my mind that these were synonyms for the exact same thing. And there was a writer named Alvin Toffler who wrote quite, well, I should say, perhaps he's still alive, so I should say there is an author named Alvin Toffler, and he wrote that every civilization has a hidden code, a set of rules or principles that run through all its activities like a repeated design. And so this pattern that I'm referring to, I'll give you some. I formed this little chart, which is, unfortunately I couldn't get my thumb drive to work today, but it's a little chart here, and it's called a radial category. And you start out with the word domination in the center, and then the spokes radiate out from that. And these are various synonyms from the literature, from papal bulls and other documents. Invade, capture, vanquish, subdue, subjugate, dominion, tame, colonize, paramount, domesticate, conquest, sovereign, civilization, empire, government, reduce, subject, overthrow. And so you might be wondering, well, why would, for example, the word civilization be in there? Everyone seems to look at that as a fairly positive term. But when you go to the Webster's Third International Dictionary and you look up the word, it means it means the act of civilizing, especially the forcing of a particular cultural pattern on a population to whom it is foreign. Well, the forcing is the key word there. And if the pattern that's being forced is a pattern of domination and subordination, then you can say that it's the forcing of a particular cultural pattern of domination on a population or a people or nation to whom it is foreign. And so that clues you in there. In the Papal Bull of 1493, the one from May 4th, there's a sentence in the document that says, "We trust in Him," with a capital H on Him, "from whom empires and governments and all good things proceed." But when you look at the Latin version of the document and you look up the word corresponding in the Latin word corresponding to the word governments in English, it's the word dominaciones, meaning dominations. That means that one government is dominación, which is domination. And of course the word empire is also a framework of domination. There's another sentence in the Papal Bull of May 3rd, I think it's May 3rd, 1493, that actually part of it reads, "Sub dominio, actuali, temporali, alicorum, dominorum, Christianorum, constitute non sint." And it means lands not under the domination of any Christian dominator. Dominorum Christianorum means Christian dominator. I had the opportunity to ask the Vatican ambassador not this past session, but the one before that. I didn't know he was the ambassador, but I knew he was with the Holy See. And so I asked him, I said, "You probably know Latin." I said, "What does Dominorum Christianorum mean?" And he said, "Well, it probably means lords, probably master, probably Mr. Yes, Mr. And I said, "Oh, okay. So in other words, lands not possessed by any Mr. Christian?" And he said, "Well, it's best not to translate it into English because it would not fit." Meaning that if you look at these terms from today's perspective, you see how outrageous they are. The idea that their deity is the source of the domination and empire and so forth that's mentioned in the document. So a little while later, I had gone into the main meeting hall and where the permanent forum was in session, and I was standing just inside the doorway talking quietly to a man I know, and I saw this gentleman from the Holy See enter the room, and I didn't think much of it because their seat is over there and to the left. And then before I knew it, he was standing right back in front of me, and he kind of took me by the arm and pulled me out of the room. And when we got outside the door, he was very pleasant. And he said, that term you were talking about, I believe that's talking about Jesus Christ or God. And I said, "Oh, okay. Well, then I have another question for you." And then I quoted the sentence about "we trust in Him." And when I got to that, he said, "That's Jesus Christ or God." And I continued, "From whom empires and dominations and all good things proceed." So if the empires and dominations are coming out of Him, who is Jesus Christ or God, does that mean it's a God of domination? And he said, Well, everything comes from God. The birds and the trees and so forth. And so he didn't really answer the question, but in a sense he kind of did. It's odd. And what I'm pointing out here is that there are these patterns in the language that we have not been cognizant of, and it's only by going back into the Latin versions of some of these documents that we begin to see what's been going on. When we asked the question, as was asked of the Canadian government at the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination not that long ago, paraphrasing, what is the basis of Canada's claim to underlying title to the Indian lands, there was no response. And I think to this day, correct me if I'm wrong, but there still is no response. And what I find strange about that is that they could have taken the book called Creation of Rights of Sovereignty Through Symbolic Acts that was published in 1938 by 3 students of a man named Charles Cheney Hyde, who was the solicitor for the United States Department of State from 1925 to 1928. And that book was published by 3 students from Columbia University. So they were in an international law program taught by 3 of the most eminent international law scholars in the world at that time. And it seems to me that Canada could easily submit that into the record and say that these rituals that were conducted provide the information necessary to know what is the claim of Canada to the underlying title or the title of sovereignty and so forth. But they don't do that. And I believe it's the same type of thing where it would not fit, as the Vatican ambassador, the nuncio, mentioned. In other words, it would be laughed off the world stage. Those things that might have seemed sensible at one time when they were just amongst themselves and their elite clubs of states are no longer going to really hold muster. One other thing I want to mention is that, had a few notes here, that when we look at the idea of the international law system, it's important to know what that is. And I somewhat differ from Walter Echo Hawke in this regard. We have to understand that international law is not a panacea, and that it's a context that has a long, long history. And it's a history that is going back to the what's called the family of nations. And in the Webster's New International Dictionary from 1950, the following definition of family of nations was provided: the aggregate of states, originally the Christian nations of Europe, which as a result of their antecedents have inherited a common civilization and are at a similar level of moral and political opinion, and have been recognized by those states as being on that level. And there was another edition which talked similarly, and it said to include the Christian states of Europe and their offshoots in America, and so forth and so on. Henry Wheaton, who was the Supreme Court reporter at the time that Johnson v. McIntosh was handed down, wrote a volume on international law called The Elements of International Law that was published in 1836. And in the advertising to the first edition, he was talking about the natural law, more properly called the law of God, and so forth. And then he said the old Christian states of Western Europe were the original members of the family of nations, because the law of nations grew up gradually between them through customs and treaties. Whenever afterwards a new Christian state made its appearance in Europe, it was received into the existing society by the old members of the family of nations. It is for this reason that this law was in former times frequently called European law of nations. And so it continues to talk about the Christian states of Europe, is my point. And it was only after Turkey was admitted in 1856, and Turkey was an Islamic country, that it could no longer be talked about in exclusively Christian terms. There's a wonderful book on international law by Professor Anthony Angie, who is from the island country of Nauru, somewhere close, fairly close, I guess, to Australia, and the island country was devastated by phosphate mining by the Australian and UK governments. And he ended up getting his JD, I should say SJD, actually the highest form of law degree, from Harvard. And he wrote a terrific book on international law that's called Imperialism, Sovereignty, and the Making of International Law. And the foreword was written by a professor named James Crawford, who was a mentor to Professor Angie. And there is an acknowledgement in that foreword of the domination-subordination system. And Crawford wrote of the history of international law and how at different times or different epochs and in different ways, the legal history of the relations between the West and non-Western polities reproduced an underlying pattern of domination and subordination, unquote. Crawford says that Professor Angie's work illustrates, quote, the relations between civilizations and peoples. Moreover, these were relations of domination, and Crawford placed italics on the word domination. So that's pointing to that pattern that I start out my talk focusing on. We see that pattern in the Papal Bull of 1452 called the Dum Diversas. And the specific language from that document authorizes the King of Portugal to go to the western coast of Africa and to other non-Christian lands and to, quote, invade, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens, pagans, and other enemies of Christ, to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, and to take away all their possessions and property. And the king is authorized to convert the land, meaning to unlawfully or wrongfully appropriate that which belongs to another. Each and every one of those terms and phrases refers in some way or another to the pattern of domination and subordination. And this is actually the whole framework of what's called international law. And so what are called states are actually states of domination. That's the state is a state of domination. And there's an amazing book called the Sociology of Colonies by Professor René Monnier from the University of Paris. It was published in 1949, and I highly recommend you try to obtain a copy. They're not that expensive getting them used. And it illustrates he was actually a professor of colonial sciences, and it shows the way in which domination is key to the whole colonization process. So one of the things I want to mention here today with regard to the claims of Canada and the United States to our traditional lands and territories is that there's something called the extinguishment process, which is the analogy or the metaphor for what's called extinguishment. What do you think of that is sometimes referred to as extinguished? There's really only one thing I can think of. Anybody? What do you extinguish? Fire? Right? You extinguish fire. You know, fire extinguisher. And what they're referring to are the council fires. The council fires of our peoples. And so when they can put out the last ember of the council fire and the people have had to completely leave and they're gone, there's no more council fires, they've extinguished the title. That's the metaphor. And in fact, one of the recent U.S. Supreme Court decisions referred to, it was one of the recent, 2005, the Supreme Court used the doctrine of discovery in a case called City of Sherrill versus Oneida Indian Nation of New York. And it had to do with whether or not the Oneida Indian Nation, after having purchased some of its traditional lands, traditional territory on the real estate market, had sovereignty that ran with the land just by virtue of now having possession of that land. And the Supreme Court used a metaphor that was something along the lines of the embers having long grown cold in the council fire of the Oneida people. And in other words, it was a one-way street. Once the land left the possession of the Oneida Nation, that was it. It could never come back and have sovereignty run with the land unless that land was put into federal trust. So it had to have the imprimatur of the federal government. And but anyway, that just kind of tells you. So what this has to do with in terms of extinguishment. And that's why I believe that it's so critically important that we acknowledge our own standards. When we looked at or thought about the planting of flags, the royal flags, which are called royal standards, what's really being talked about there? It's a double meaning, a double entendre. And so when they say they've planted their royal standards, they're talking about their royal standards of judgment, meaning that they have the supposed right to come to someone else's territory from a great distance and now set up themselves as the judge of the peoples already existing there. And so where do they get off doing that? Well, it has to do with the whole domination subordination framework. So there's a tendency to say that, well, they require this and they require that, and they're going to be the ones to judge what is wandering in Rome. All these kinds of judgments that are built into the record are ways in which they're actually following up on their original planting of those royal standards in the soil. The problem is that there hasn't been a sufficiently powerful response on our part to challenge that and contest it. And the thing that I'm getting at here is that we have thousands of years of original free and independent existence, and by virtue of that, their claims of domination and subordination will never become rightful, will never become legitimate, and will never become acceptable so long as we continue to challenge and refute that. And the only thing that we need in order to continue that position is a spiritual connectedness with our traditional lands and territories, and not forgetting who we are at our root. So these are some of the things I wanted to talk about today, but I also want to mention that it seems to me that there's been a fair amount of conditioning, that there's been a programming that we've all been subjected to. And a big part of that programming and that subjecting us, dominating us, has been conducted through the residential schools, through the boarding schools. Nobody in this room is a stranger to that information personally and otherwise. And my grandfather and great-grandfather both went to Haskell boarding school. And my grandpa ran away at the age of 15. He had been in there since, well, I guess off and on since he was 4 or 5. And when he ran away, they put AWOL on his file. He went AWOL by running off, and because it was a military academy. So you can't go through a military academy conditioning without having a type of programming conducted on your psyche. And so it's important for us to make sure, this is my view, that we are still resisting the policies and agenda of assimilation on the part of the dominating systems. And the whole reconciliation process is nothing but that. Them talking about reconciling an original existence with their assumed sovereignty of the crown is a way of saying that, well, we need to quell the rebelliousness of these people who keep insisting that they have a right of self-determination and so forth. So we'll talk in terms of reconciliation. That term comes right out of the Inquisition. And it was the idea that a heretic could renounce his or her errors and be brought into the bosom of the church. And so if you look up the dictionary definition, it means to bring back into submission. There's that domination terminology again, or to bring back into the church. And so there are so many of these terms that people take for granted and don't look at them closely and realize where the traps are. The 19th and 20th century policymakers were talking about assimilating our peoples into their dominating society, and it's imperative that we continue to resist that and not lose sight of the fact that we have an original free and independent existence which delegitimizes their claims of a right of domination, and that we have the right to a continued existence, and will forever have that right, spiritually, culturally, and otherwise. What they did in the boarding schools and through other policies of genocide, one of the things that they did was engage in what I call linguicide, the intentional killing of our languages, or the intentional effort to kill our languages. And elders that I spoke with from different reservations, some of the various things that they described to me personally were having their tongues put on dry ice, just as small children, the top layer of skin being peeled off their tongues, made to kneel on broken tile with bare knees, and so that their knees bled, strapped. This is a whole litany of horrendous things that we all know about, and much worse than that. But it's part of this additional effort to break down the people. There's a term in Latin called reducere, and it means to reduce, to bring down. And there's a sentence in the Johnson versus McIntosh ruling which says, their rights, meaning the Indians' rights, to complete sovereignty as independent nations were necessarily diminished, there's that reduction terminology, were necessarily diminished by the original fundamental principle that discovery gave title to those who made it. And what that's saying is that the original free and independent existence, and what's termed sovereignty that goes with that, was somehow ended by them claiming a right of discovery. But what were they really claiming? They were claiming a right of domination. And so when Marshall equates, as Robert Miller pointed out earlier, he equates discovery with conquest, it's because they actually mean the exact same thing. Now think about that for a moment. How could discovery mean the same thing as conquest? The way in which to understand that is to take the word conquest and break it apart. C-O-N, that's one word, con, and then quest. What is the quest? The quest is for non-Christian lands that have not yet been forced under domination or under Christian domination. And so the completed state or condition of the quest, meaning the C-O-N is a prefix meaning a completed state or condition. So the completed state of that particular quest to locate lands that are not yet under domination is called conquest. In other words, the discovery is an effort to engage in that quest, and once you've completed that quest, then the end result is called conquest. It's all very, very neatly put together in that way. So it's kind of trickery, really. It's semantic trickery. And so it's quite amazing to go deep into these documents and see all these patterns. How am I doing on time? Okay, so we're going 15 more minutes, roughly. I want to leave a little bit of time for questions and answers. One of the things that I wanted to also mention is that Robert Miller did a good job of mentioning, and several others mentioned, terra nullius. But there's actually a different term called terra nullus. How many have heard of terra nullus? Not nullius, but nullus. Well, terra nullus was defined by Francis Lieber, who was the first political scientist in the United States. He was somebody who emigrated from, I believe it was Austria. Brilliant man. And he defined terra nullus as lands inhabited by heathens, pagans, infidels, or unbaptized persons. And the right of discovery, as described by Mr. B.A. Hinsdale in 1888, was talking about, he said, the claim was of the terra nullus. He said the habit of regarding an enemy's property as nobody's property originated in the assumption that communities are restored to a state of nature by the outbreak of hostilities and so forth. And then there's this part here where he talks about the doctrine of nullus. we have seen that the Roman law, well, here we are, but the principle becomes effectual only when supplemented by the church definition of nullus. That definition supplied the lacking premise in the demonstration. And the term of nullus was a heathen, pagan, infidel, or unbaptized person. Paganism, which meant being unbaptized, said Dr. Lieber, deprived the individual of those rights which a true legal morality considered inherent in each human being. And the principle only becomes effectual when supplemented with the church definition of nullus. And so then he says, grant that res nullius is the property of the finder, that an infidel is nullus, that the American savage is an infidel, and the argument is complete. That the church, one of whose great duties is to protect the weak and helpless, should have supplied one half of the logic that justified the spoliation and enslavement of the heathen is one of the anomalies of history. And we have seen that the Roman law furnished a full legal justification for the appropriation of the New World by the Christian nations. And so it's based on this type of research that I emphasize the fact that so much of this was done in the name of Christianity and through the explicit use of that term. So pretty much that wraps up the kinds of information I was going to discuss today. I will say that there is a key point also, though, in terms of how the Roman law looked at particular terms such as occupatio. Occupatio is the principle of occupation. So effective occupation is the idea that an invasive force comes in and it actually asserts occupation to that enemy territory. Occupancy, on the other hand, is a term that John Marshall, Chief Justice John Marshall, used in the Johnson v. McIntosh decision to make a distinction between a native right of occupancy and the claimed right of occupation by the colonizing power. It's important, by the way, to look closely at the word aboriginal. When people are discussing aboriginal title, what does that come from? Well, it actually is an adjective. The word aboriginal is an adjective of the word aborigine. An aborigine is a single person. And when you look up that definition, it says a native inhabitant of a particular place as distinguished from an invading, colonizing population. So the larger context of the word aboriginal is the invading and colonizing population. And so the aboriginal title is the title as distinguished from the invading or the claim title of the invading, colonizing society. But more than that, it's the actual title that's assigned by the invading, colonizing society to the original peoples. And I'll leave you with this thought. When they claim that they have extinguished an aboriginal title of occupancy, all they have extinguished is something that they constructed out of their own minds. In other words, they created a mental projection of what they said was true of our nations and peoples, and then they said they extinguished that. Well, all they did was extinguish their own idea. So it doesn't mean anything. We have thousands and thousands of years of original, free, and independent existence with our ceremonies and our spirituality and our cultures and so forth, and that means everything compared to their pretensions, a term that Chief Justice John Marshall used. A pretension is simply something that's pretended, like claiming that you've created sovereignty by waving a sword in the air and creating a notarized document. So I thank you very much for having me here today. I'm very privileged and honored to be in the mix with everyone that spoke here today, and I'll look forward to tomorrow's presentations as well. And if you have a couple of questions during our remaining time, I'd be happy to respond to them. Thank you very much. Yes.
I want to thank you for your words. As you were threading the meaning of the Latin and the English words in saying the domination part,
yeah.
I couldn't help but think, what are very intricate and complex laws that regulated our shared use and how we managed our resources. But as a nation, when we're going and saying we're going to subdivide up our territories in the fashion of the doctrine of discovery, are we doing that to ourselves now? Is that happening in the United States as well?
Well, yeah, anytime, I mean, it's interesting, these are very complex questions, and a lot of it has to do with context, and a lot of it has to do what's beneficial in terms of an approach. A lot of times people talk about a strategy, but what I think we also need to talk about, what is our language strategy? And how are we going to work out the relations between our various nations and peoples, regardless of what's going on with the dominating society, but just even amongst ourselves. And those are very complicated issues because of so much, you know, just all the patterns that have happened up to this point. So there are no quick and easy answers that I have to something along those lines, but I will say that, for example, there's an area called Ocotillo, where the United States government is working with a large corporation called Pattern Energy to put wind turbines on area that is considered to be Kumeyaay territory, but it can also be considered to be a shared area with the Quetzan and Cocopa nations. And so there's a dynamic that happens there when you have different peoples having overlapping history with a particular area, and how do folks work those kinds of things out. And hopefully through the revitalization of our spiritual and cultural traditions, we can figure out how to make sure that we have beneficial relations with each other, but it's not going to be an easy road. It's going to have challenges, and there are going to be differences at times and disagreements at times, so we have to figure out how to work through those. That would be my immediate answer, anyway. Any other questions or comments? Challenges? Yes, ma'am.
If Aboriginal has a negative interpretation, what do you call yourself?
Original. And I was up in Manitoba, and I used the term Aboriginal because I thought that was common up here, and in the north here. And I was some of the elders let me know they didn't agree with that term. So I started thinking about it, and I got curious about that. And it didn't take me long to figure out that, well, the word abnormal means not normal, so what does Aboriginal mean? And so I started thinking about that, but then I looked it up in the dictionary, and I saw that it meant that. Now, just because something means something in a dictionary, it depends on context, too. I was talking with a Kumeyaay man, and he received a phone call. And so he's talking on the cell phone. He said, "What does the body look like?" And I thought, wow, that could be taken a lot of different ways. And I could only know once I knew what the context of the conversation was. Was it a body of a murder victim? Was it the body of a woman's hair? Was it the car body? What kind of body was it? And you can only know in this particular context. So that's always key. It's critical as to what the context of a particular term is. For example, I recently pointed out at the Gathering of the Clans 2 gathering in Vancouver a couple weekends ago that the term indigenous and the international working definition of it, when you start to parse it, it actually leads to dominated peoples. It's talking about the society prevailing, non-dominant society. It's the opposite of all these things. In other words, the context is the dominating part. And then Art said, well, he pointed out, he said, well, and Indian people in 1977, Oran Lions and others, had a large international gathering, and they had to decide what are we going to call ourselves, because in order to get a kind of a universal term, not everybody was okay with the term with Indian and so forth. So what do you do? So then they chose indigenous. Well, that doesn't change the fact that in a given context it still might mean dominated, But then maybe some people don't care for that and they don't want to acknowledge themselves as dominated. So we just have to work through what are the contexts and the ways in which we're using these terms, and to be very conscious of how we're using them and to not use the terminology in an unconscious way. Yes?
My name is and I'm a student of law at Thompson University, and I was wondering if the question about the sovereignty should go to international level, or it should be resolved at the Supreme Court of Canada.
Which question about sovereignty?
The question about the sovereignty within the Indian territory.
Well, are you referring to the claim of crown sovereignty or Indian nation sovereignty? Well, I mean, I understood that when I was listening to Louise in particular talk about the cases, I was thinking about honor among thieves, and so, I mean, it doesn't make a heck of a lot of sense to submit your, this is the other thing that really bugs me, is here's these people coming to a shore and claiming something that doesn't even belong to them. Then somehow the whole narrative gets switched around where we're claiming our own lands. That doesn't make any sense. And the Hopi put it very well. The Hopi elders, they said, we're not going to claim from a white man who just came here recently something that already belongs to us. Why in the world would we do that? But they set up these claims processes and then make it look like it's just perfectly normal and natural to go into something that's going to extinguish your, extinguish their idea of who you are. But nonetheless create this fabrication and this kind of trickery of the mind to make it look like, oh, we lost everything. I mean, it's sad. Yes? Well, how about honor and respect? Okay. Well, let me respond to that just with a little bit of analysis of the question, which is, how do you redo something you never did to begin with? Now, if you never had conciliatory relations to begin with, how in the world do you redo that? I mean, it's not even accurate use of language. It's really nonsensical on its face, and unfortunately people don't recognize that. But the question is a good one, because then what are we going to put in place of that? And so I think that there's an honor and respect that needs to occur on the part of the dominating society to acknowledge the existence of our traditional lands and territories, and to create those honorings in a way that has not occurred. I mean, I was very gratified to hear the dean of the law school do such an eloquent address and to honor and respect the Shuswap nation as just one example. But anyway, I think that there just needs to be a clear examination of the kinds of terms that are being used and make sure that there's no traps that are built into them. And I very much see a trap in the word reconciliation, especially when you look at specific documents and the way in which the Canadian government has been using that term in specific contexts, which I have analyzed. Yes? Mm-hmm.
I'd be interested in finding out, because I went to residential school, and of course that means growing up in a hierarchy where there was the priests, the brothers, the nuns, then the boys, then the girls, and then the little children. So my question is, in all the research with the history of Salish people
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Where's the role of women in all of that? Because I think that's a huge piece that's missing in our ability to respect and trust one another and to raise children in a good way.
Well, I'm really glad that you asked that question, and I have to say that I was remiss in not focusing a bit more on that. Well, I didn't focus on it at all. So, but it's a critical piece, and it's something that Virgil emphasizes in terms of the traditional laws and the original laws. And when we look at the role of the church and the way that women have been, I mean, let me put it this way, that women have been on the front end of the domination subordination pattern through the colonization process. And so the proper role of women, the central role of women within the traditional societies has been really damaged and eroded. And so this is another one of those challenges. What do people do to restore and put those patterns back into their proper place? And
My understanding of Alexander Mackenzie, the guy who founded it, he would not have made it across Canada had it not been for some of the women who assisted him in crossing the wilderness and feeding him and clothing him and making snowshoes for him and whatever else he needed to have done to
well, I mean, that's probably a separate issue, but in terms of the central role of women in terms of the nurturance of traditional societies, I mean, I think that's obviously something that has been severely, as I said before, damaged and eroded. And those are big challenges, because that means that we as men have to look at our behavior and how we conduct ourselves, and how women tend to get marginalized within political systems and overall systems culturally and so forth. And sometimes people don't like to give that up, you know. So that's where that humbleness and humility comes in for men, where how do we make sure that we as men are creating those patterns and those openings for women to be back in those central positions. And that's fundamentally important to what needs to happen in terms of the shift. So, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.